All right, so I'm going to now invite our staff to come up onto the stage to get us going for the opening plenary. Katie Spiker, Katie Brown, Amanda Bergson-Shilcock, Kermit Kaleba, and Melissa Johnson are going to start to walk you through a number of the issues that you'll want to know in terms of what's happening in conversations here in Washington, D.C. So as they're getting seated, thank you all for being here. Thanks for your attention. And let me turn things over to Katie Spiker, our Director of Government Relations.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Andy, and thank you everyone for being here. Welcome to some of the content for our 2020 Skills Summit. I feel like in the entry or the intro remarks that I have for each of my sessions, I find myself writing, this is one of my favorite parts of the summit. But I'm going to repeat that or say it for the first time right now. This is one of my favorite parts of the summit, in part because I'm sitting here with my colleagues up on the stage. And just to give away some of the polling results, for folks who filled out the poll ahead of coming to the Skills Summit, where it asked you what were you most looking forward to, networking and spending time with your colleagues was the overwhelming top priority for folks as they came in today, followed by getting time on the Hill. So we will blend the two and spend some time with my colleagues and then talk about how we can talk about what is happening on the Hill right now and where does skills play into those conversations. So as Andy said, I'm joined by my four colleagues, Katie, Melissa, Kermit, and Amanda. And most of what we're going to talk about today will be part of deeper dive conversations later this week. So we'll have breakout sessions this afternoon on work-based learning and the Higher Education Act. So we're going to talk through what are the priorities that NSC has been focused on over the year in those issues, and you'll get much more information in those breakout sessions later this afternoon. Tomorrow morning, we're going to do a set of policy development breakouts where we're really going to be asking you to give us feedback on policy recommendations that staff have put together based on the work that you all are doing to prepare workers and businesses for technological change in the workplace. And then tomorrow afternoon, we'll have a breakout on the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Before we get to those issues and a couple others, a couple top-line thoughts about what's happening in DC. So the first is that skills is a bipartisan issue. We continue to see bipartisan support from members on both sides of the aisle for skills, and we've seen this most recently in the passage of the most recent appropriations package that included increases for the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act state grants. It included $20 million increase for state grants under Perkins CTE, and included another $15 million for adult ed. We've also got bipartisan bills that you'll hear about in the breakout sessions that have champions from both the Democrats and Republicans from higher education, work-based learning, infrastructure. Despite these champions, though, and the fact that skills is something that we could actually see move in 2020, the way that we're going to see things go from having champions to making progress is because of the conversations of folks in this room and what happens on Wednesday. Because the next year's will be a difficult one to move anything in DC. We've got a 2-year budget deal, so the increases that we saw in the appropriations package next year will be much more difficult to see follow in 2021. So we saw these increases, but the advocacy that we'll be doing on the Hill on Wednesday and over the next year will be focused on continuing those increases, reflecting the fact that over the past 2 decades, Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act state grants have declined by 40%, and at the same time we're facing an impending shift in the workplace that's going to massively require additional training for new workers. So from the national polling that we did over the last year, we know that 85% of voters and 79% of business leaders want new public investment in skills, and communicating this to members of Congress over the next week will be vital. In order to make this progress, in order to go from skills being an issue that members care about to it being a priority, that'll require the kind of advocacy that'll happen over the next week. And in order to make the kind of progress that's necessary, in order to prepare businesses and workers for that technological change, in order to address the effects of policies that have led to racial disparities, and in order to help workers access jobs, the backbone of the economy, we need that kind of priority on skills issues. The good news is that voters want it. 85% of voters want that more public investment in skills, and 50%, by a margin of 50%, voters are more likely to vote for a candidate who is strong on skills, something that we'll talk about in our plenary tomorrow morning. And there's lots of legislative opportunities in order to move skills. So I'm going to turn to my fellow panelists to talk about those issues. But before we do, one of the ways in which we know that there is an overwhelming opportunity to address some of the skills challenges is because of the different conversations happening up on the Hill that have a skills component to them. So if folks open up your app, you can help us decide where this conversation is going to go and what the last question of this session will be. If you go to the app, on the bottom right, select More, select Live Poll, and vote for one of 5 options that the experts on this stage will tie and explain the skills component to. So your options are climate change, veterans, aging, criminal justice, and rural issues. And when we wrap up some of the content that's part of the Skills for Good Jobs 2020 agenda, we'll turn to the answer that got the most requests and have folks talk about the skills component of that. So in the meantime, as folks are voting, Katie, I'll turn to you. Let's talk about Higher Education Act and where the conversation is on reauthorization.
My favorite topic. Yeah, so there's a lot to say about higher education, and I know a lot of you in this room are intimately familiar with how important post-secondary education is for people succeeding in today's economy. We know that 80% of jobs or more require some form of higher education or training beyond the high school level. And I will say, before I joined National Skills Coalition almost 3 years ago, or 2.5 years ago at this point, which is crazy, I worked on Capitol Hill for a couple different members of Congress. And when I was there, this was in 2010, 2011, there wasn't really many conversations merging higher education and skills, or higher education and the workforce. They were kept pretty separately. It was traditional students on this end, 18 to 21-year-olds living on campus. That's who we talked about when we talked about higher education. Then we talked about workforce training programs as a whole separate thing. I will say one of the most optimistic things I can tell you, I know sometimes when we talk about the Hill it doesn't seem that optimistic, but I can say that the narrative around higher education has completely changed on the Hill. There are a lot of policymakers who you'll hear from throughout the course of the summit that care deeply about skills in higher education, that care deeply about making it more accessible for today's students. And that recognize that today's students, the face of today's students are changing, and they're different than they were even 10 years ago when we had our last Higher Education Act reauthorization. And so I'll keep it short and say that in the House and Senate, there is an appetite for reauthorizing the Higher Education Act. It's the biggest investment in post-secondary programs at the federal level. And last Congress, we saw that momentum build. We saw the Senate, both Republicans and Democrats, talking about a bipartisan reauthorization. We saw the House have 2 separate bills, one Republican, one Democrat, that would reauthorize the Higher Education Act. Even though there was no legislation that crossed the finish line, that's really important to build momentum when it comes to Congress. Things move rather slowly sometimes. But this Congress, it's the same thing. There's the same momentum, if not more, around reauthorizing the Higher Education Act. And for context, Senator Alexander, who is the chairman of the HELP committee on the Senate side, he's a former education secretary under George H.W. Bush, and this is his last year in Congress. And so he really, really wants to see the Higher Education Act reformed as part of his legacy moving forward. And so I think that leaves room for bipartisan movement on this bill. So going to the Hill now and talking about your priorities, it's very timely.
And let's get to what those priorities are that NFC is focused on.
Yeah, sure. So National Skills Coalition, with the help of our members and our coalition members and you all who do this work on the ground, we've created what we call a community college compact, which is a set of 4 policies that we would like to see as part of a Higher Education Act reauthorization. So the first one is called the Jobs Act. A lot of you may be intimately familiar with it, but basically what it would do is it would modernize the Pell Grant program. Because as a lot of you know, right now, students, in order to get Pell, they need to be enrolled in a program that's at least 600 clock hours over 15 weeks of instruction. And it doesn't take into account that students are going into other types of post-secondary pathways that might not meet those parameters. And so the Jobs Act would drop down that clock hour threshold to 150 clock hours over 8 weeks, but still keeping in mind that we need to make sure that these programs are of high quality for students. Because we want to make the higher education system flexible, but we also all have a vested interest in protecting students. I'll just mention the leads on that bill are Senators Kane and Portman on the Senate side, and then Representatives Gonzalez and Richmond on the House side. The second prong of our Community College Compact is called the College Transparency Act. And this basically lifts up the importance of transparent data at the post-secondary education and training level. Right now, we know that educational institutions report to the Department of Education their institution-level data, but we don't really have a good system for collecting student-level data and making that transparent. And this is really important, right, because students need to know when they're picking a program what will help them succeed, which types of programs. And employers need to know that information, training providers need to know that information, what's working for students. The last two prongs of the compact have to do with partnerships at the state and local level, which we all know are really important for increasing access to high quality training. The first one, the Community College to Career Fund Act, really prioritizes partnerships between community colleges and businesses. We know that those partnerships exist now, but we know that the federal government doesn't really have a steady stream of funding to support those partnerships. So we're saying if you're looking at modernizing the Higher Education Act, make sure that you're sustaining those partnerships at the local level. And then the Gateway to Careers Act is the last prong of the compact. And it basically prioritizes career pathways, which we know are really important for combining basic skills instruction and other types of supports with supportive services like transportation and childcare, all of these things together that make a comprehensive system for a student to be able to succeed, especially adult students and students of color who may face other barriers when trying to succeed in the post-secondary system. So this bill really prioritizes those partnerships.
And there will be more detail about all of these and more context in this afternoon session.
Oh yeah, come to my HEA breakout. It'll be 3:20 to 4:50, and it's going to be a lot of fun.
And at the same time as that session, we'll be talking work-based learning.
Yes.
And so let's dive into some of the priorities there. So in 2017, the president put out an executive order on what he's called industry-recognized apprenticeship programs. We saw draft regulations on that effort to expand work-based learning last year. We expect to see final regulations out this spring. So a lot is in flux around where the administration's efforts around expanding work-based learning has been under these industry-recognized apprenticeships. On the legislative side, the House is working on a comprehensive apprenticeship bill that's going to put scaffolding around how DOL spends the almost $200 million that they appropriated last year. And the Senate's a little bit further behind, but also having conversations about what apprenticeship legislation would look like. Katie, where have NFCs priorities in this conversation been?
Sure, so I'm going to bring up again the importance of partnerships, and this bill is cleverly named the Partners Act. I'm not sure who takes credit for that, it's not me.
I don't know, but the amount of lobbying time we had to declare for the group of us sitting in the room coming up with that acronym is
yes. But basically this bill really stresses the importance of partnerships again, industry-led partnerships that are critical to expanding work-based learning opportunities. And we know that not one group of stakeholders, of industry stakeholders, can do this alone at the scale that we need. And we know that partnerships are vital to being able to scale work-based learning programs for all workers and making them accessible. So that's what the Partners Act would do. And then our last ask here is called the Skill Up Act, and this one's actually really exciting. Representative Horsford's going to be talking about it today because he's leading it in Congress, and basically what it would do is it would take the work opportunity tax credit, which already exists, to give employers a credit for hiring individuals specifically from low-income populations, and it would basically give them an extra credit for adding work-based learning into the mix. So not only are they getting a credit for hiring an individual, but they're also getting a little bit of help when it comes to enrolling them in a work-based learning program, because we know how important work-based learning is to success and long-term success.
And a really active conversation on the Hill.
Yeah.
Melissa, we've heard from Katie on Higher Education Act and work-based learning about partnerships and support services. over the past year, NSC has on the state side, has wrapped a learning academy on work-based learning with 5 states, launched one on support services with 5 more, and reached 20 SkillSpan affiliates. So what are the lessons from the states that you're seeing that align with and support the policy recommendations we're making here?
Well, there are 2 main lessons. Really, first, that support services are really critical to completing work-based learning programs and completing all of the programs basically that Katie was talking about, right? In the work-based learning academy specifically, we saw states like Indiana and Washington focus specifically on advancing policies, creating and advancing policies for support services for participants in work-based learning programs, because they recognize the value of support services to completing those programs. And in the Supportive Services Academy, we're seeing that same recognition. We got almost triple the amount of applications from, mostly from our SkillSpan folks, because they recognize that support services are critical to your completion of a higher education program or work-based learning program, a career pathways program. So we're seeing that importance. And then the second lesson we're learning is, or kind of reiterating, is the importance of and the interdependence of the state and the federal. Federal programs provide that critical foundation for supportive services, right? And state funds in a lot of ways can be added to that funding for supportive services, and a lot of times can leverage more federal funding. So we see that interdependence and working together.
I like how you said cementing, because I'm sure these are things that everybody in the room knows and is trying to do, and yet are still really interesting lessons for staff and members to hear about the importance of putting money behind it. Kermit, another place that NSC's policy priorities have focused on support services and partnerships is around the infrastructure conversation. It's a really live conversation. I don't know that 2 weeks ago we would have thought that it would be such a big conversation happening on the Hill right now. But just last week, Transportation and Infrastructure Committee in the House released a framework that would fund $760 billion investment in infrastructure. It mentioned workforce a couple times, but did not go into detail. The Congressional Black Caucus released principles also last week that had a greater focus on workforce. And then there was a Ways and Means hearing about how to pay for it, where members brought up the idea of workforce. So it's part of the conversation, but is that enough?
No, it's a great question. And it's funny, we talked about doing an infrastructure panel a few months ago, and we're like, we're not going to have an infrastructure conversation. And then, of course, Congress decides to have one. So, so we decided to talk about it in this panel. So I mean, infrastructure, as folks know, infrastructure has always been a policy conversation, I think, has seemed like a really good fit for the workforce community to be a part of, right? Because we know that infrastructure is a real driver of job growth. So, folks may remember the Georgetown Center on Education and Workforce came out with an estimate a few years ago that said that if you were to invest $1 trillion in infrastructure, that would create as many as 11 million new jobs. And we've also seen a lot of research, recently studies out of the federal government and other places talking about replacement jobs, right? So anywhere from 4 to 6 million jobs that are going to need to be filled due to retirements and other factors. So there's a real opportunity in the infrastructure space for job creation and for people to be moving into those jobs. But historically, it has not been a workforce conversation. A lot of times, in infrastructure legislation, there's an acknowledgement that there needs to be some emphasis on skilling up the workforce in order to take advantage of those jobs. And they're good jobs, right? They're jobs that do require some education and training beyond the high school level. They're jobs that really do land in the communities where we're making the investments. And they're jobs that can't be outsourced for the most part, right? So they're really good jobs, and there's a reason why folks in our community have always been interested in being a bigger part of those conversations. I think the challenge historically has been that is really, frankly, just a jurisdictional issue. So big infrastructure legislation, whether we're talking about the big highway bills that we all think about. So the most recent one was the FAST Act a few years ago, or the Federal Aviation Reauthorization Act. All of those bills go through the transportation committees on the Hill. And by and large, the transportation committees are interested primarily in bricks and mortar, right? They're interested in actually making investments in concrete and bricks and what have you. Maybe, I don't know if they're actually interested in bricks per se, but they often don't get around to the workforce conversation, and the agencies that administer these programs often don't pay as much attention to the workforce side. So we have seen some modest investments in workforce over time. So the FAST Act, the most recent highway transportation bill, did include language that allowed states to continue to use transportation funds for job training within the infrastructure sector. But one of the things we know is states haven't really taken advantage of that opportunity, in part because they're having to make a choice between capital investments and human capital. So I think what's incumbent upon us as we go up to the Hill and as Congress is gearing up for this conversation is we really need to shift that paradigm, and we really need to be focusing on how do we make skills a priority? How do we make sure that an infrastructure investment isn't just an investment in infrastructure? As important as that is, how are we also making sure that we're investing in the people who are going to build and maintain that infrastructure? So the piece of legislation that we've been most closely associated with is a bipartisan bill called the BUILDS Act. The BUILDS Act it was sponsored by Senators Kaine and Portman on the Senate side. The main sponsors on the House side were Congressman Mitchell, Congressman Thompson, Congresswoman Bonamici, and Congressman Langevin. It's a very bipartisan bill. The BUILDS Act, similar to some of the themes we've already heard, would invest in dedicated infrastructure partnerships, so partnerships between infrastructure employers, particularly small and medium-sized businesses, and other community partners, including workforce boards, labor unions, community-based organizations, community colleges, to develop and implement talent pipelines that help move people into and up in infrastructure careers. And the thing that's important about it is it's both business-facing bills, so there's funding to support the work of recruiting and bringing in workers, but it's also, to the point that we were just mentioning, it's also about investing in support services. So there are requirements built into these partnerships that you have to be providing both pre-employment services to targeted populations, so really thinking intentionally about pre-apprenticeship and other strategies to bring people, including populations that have historically been left out of the conversation, bringing them into the pipeline and making sure that they have the skills and the preparation they need in order to be successful. But then there's also a requirement that these partnerships provide post-employment services for up to 6 months after individuals are hired. Because as we know, it's not just about getting a job, it's about getting in the job and staying in the job. And we know that a lot of times the transition from training program to employment can be one of the hardest transition points for the folks that we're trying to serve, the folks that you all are trying to serve. So the BUILDS Act really tries to get at both how do we make sure that we're bringing people into and diversifying the pipeline and infrastructure, but also how are we making sure that once people get to those jobs, they have the supports they need to succeed and to thrive and to stay in those jobs and advance in those careers. The other piece, we just mentioned the Skill Up Act. We think that the Skill Up Act, the legislation that Congressman Horford is introducing around the work opportunity tax credit is going to be a real opportunity to help businesses be engaged in this conversation. We know that investing in partnerships is important, but we also know that for a lot of businesses, particularly small and medium-sized businesses, it can be a challenge to think about ramping up work-based learning if they haven't done so already. So I think that's going to be another part of the conversation as we think about how do we make infrastructure, how do we make skills central to an infrastructure conversation.
And building on that same theme, one of the areas where we've heard skills be part of the conversation but not central is this idea of what does technological change mean for workers and what does it mean for businesses? We've been relying on the idea that of estimates, 60% of jobs are going to significantly shift over the next decade, and another 10 to 20% will be eliminated, which means that 100 million workers will need to be upskilled or reskilled in order to stay in the workplace. 89% of likely voters want policies to support upskilling and reskilling for workers who've been impacted by this technological change. And this is the foundation of the set of breakouts that we'll have tomorrow morning. One on digital literacy, one on modernizing reemployment, and one on business engagement to address the challenges associated with the future of work. Kermit, where's the Hill conversation around the future of work? and where are NFCs priorities?
Sure. Yeah. So the future of work is a very, very hot topic on Capitol Hill right now. I'm guessing most of you will get asked about the future of work. If you don't bring it up, you will probably be asked about the future of work. But it's an interesting conversation because it's not clear that anybody really knows what the future of work means, right? When they're asking about the future of work. So, when we get contacted by offices, it tends to be kind of fall into one of a couple of different buckets, right? We get folks who are like, well, could we do a bill that adds the word automation to something? And will that solve the problem? And the answer is it probably won't hurt. It's probably not going to help, not going to solve the whole problem. We get a lot of questions about sort of like, we want to do something on the future of work. Like what? What should we do? And then we also do get some concerns. I think the thing, to this question about the 100 million jobs, I think there are also a lot of offices that are just very concerned about, they're hearing a lot about robots and AI and automation. And so there is a real sense that something big is going to happen in the course of the next decade, and it's really going to impact a lot of people, and they just want to be helpful, but they don't know where to get started. From our perspective, you'll not be surprised. We think that skills and education and training are going to need to be central to the future of work conversation. And you mentioned a couple of ways in which we're trying to tackle this, right? We recognize one area that we need to be looking at is how are we thinking about our investments in incumbent worker training. We know that we're going to see tens of millions of jobs change over the course of the next few years. We need to really be thinking about how we're catching people while they're on the job and while their jobs are changing and making sure that we're investing in their skills. So what does that look like? How do we make sure that we're creating pathways for people who are in the job but may be facing major disruptions because of because of technology? We know that there's also likely to be major disruptions in terms of the number of workers who may be out of job because of technological change. So as you say, we're going to be focusing on that. And then this issue of digital literacy, I think, is really critical. We're hearing so much from employers and from other thinkers about the importance of digital literacy. So much of work is done today through computers and through other forms of technology. But we know, and Amanda's got a fantastic Hill briefing on Wednesday if you get a chance to go see it. We know that a lot of workers are not don't have the digital literacy skills that they need in order to be competitive in the 21st century, and so that's going to be really, really important. In terms of how we're approaching the work, we've, here in Washington, National Skills Coalition has been leading a series of discussions with a number of other national groups to talk about various aspects of how do we make skills central to the future of work conversation. I think we want policymakers to understand that there is going to be a future of work. We know there's going to be a future of work. They don't have to wait for it to happen. There are actually things that we can be doing to be increasing our capacity, increasing our ability to help workers and businesses adapt to the future of work. And so I think that's going to be our key message. One of our key messages is making sure that we're being proactive and we're focusing on a skills-centered approach. The other thing I'll say is, and I think this is another key message that we're really focused on is, we want to make sure as we think about the future of work that we don't replicate some of the mistakes of the past, right? We know that historically that employment opportunities, educational opportunities, opportunities to build wealth have not been equally distributed and equally shared. As we start to think about the future of work, as we start to think about how we're preparing all workers for the jobs of tomorrow, we want to make sure that we really are talking about all workers. We want to make sure that the policies that we're pursuing really do create meaningful, realistic opportunities for all workers, including workers of color, in order to be successful, in order to succeed in today's economy. So as you're up on the Hill talking about the future of work, and as you're sitting in our sessions tomorrow, these are kind of the two themes I think are really important, making sure that we're being proactive and focused on skills, but also making sure that we're looking forward to an equitable future and one where everyone really does have a chance to succeed.
Katie, you're leading one of the breakouts tomorrow. Anything you want to add about what folks should expect from those?
Yeah, no, I just want to emphasize Kermit's point about, this is still a very active conversation. People on the Hill are really asking us, future of work, what do we do? And the first thing that happens when we get a question like that is we say, well, we need to talk to our members, our coalition members about that. And so tomorrow is a live representation of that happening. We really want you to bring your ideas to the table. This is still very much a work in progress, and we want you to be hands-on involved. So we're really excited about those sessions tomorrow.
Amanda, I'm gonna turn to you and to Kermit. As the two up on the stage who were here during the thick of Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act in 2014, believe it or not, up for reauthorization again this year, even if we're not going to expect a wholesale rewriting of the legislation. What should policymakers start to focus on now? Keeping in mind, I just looked this up, almost half of the policymakers today were not here when WIOA was passed in 2014. So it's not just talking to them about what they learned, it's also helping them think about what even is WIOA. So what have we learned since 2014?
That's a great question, and thank you, Katie. It's lovely to be here with all of you. I've just been sitting here appreciating my amazing coworkers. So not only are a lot of congressional representatives new since 2014, a lot of congressional staff are new. In fact, I would say the majority of folks you're going to be talking to. So while you know and you may feel that you're clear inside and out about what's working well about the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act and what kind of technical fixes you'd like to see, the increased investment you'd like to see from Congress, that's not necessarily going to be clear to them. And so they need to hear from you about what's working well in your communities, how things like integrated education and training are taking hold. We've seen real growth in that area. There's now 43,000 adults who are participating in integrated education and training opportunities like the iBest model, but that's still only 3.2% of the adults being served under Title II of the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. So it's a glass half full, glass half empty. We need greater investment. We need some technical fixes, but most of all and most importantly, we need your stories about how you're using WIOA resources on the ground to translate that to Congress to help them connect the dots to understand what the legislation is, why it's important, and how it fits into some of these other conversations that my colleagues have just been talking about, right? WIOA is part of what creates those on-ramps for workers of color, workers with basic skills gaps. It is those things that we were talking about when we were talking about the Builds Act and the Partners Act. Those foundations, those pre-apprenticeships, those are in many cases coming out of the adult education side of WIOA, coming out of the workforce system, and it's not always clear to the folks on the Hill that those connections are happening. So it's part of your role to illustrate that as you're having your Hill conversations and to really impart some urgency to folks on the Hill around the importance of investing at an appropriate level in WIOA, because in inflation-adjusted terms, as Katie said at the beginning here, we've really seen a drop in investment. I know Kermit has some things to add on Title I here, so I will hand off to him. The last thing I will mention before I do that, though, is buried in Title II of WIOA is a mention of digital literacy, right? It's an allowable activity in the jargon of federal statutes, right? And it's the one place in federal legislation where digital literacy actually is mentioned. And so as you're talking to offices about the future of work, and as they're sort of panicking about robots and jobs and disproportionate impact on workers of color, you know, you can remind them that this is an area where they could make additional investment and where there's already been some action happening. And I will say that my colleague Caroline Trichetta has been absolutely invaluable in getting materials ready for our Hill briefing on Thursday, where we'll be presenting a whole new set of data on digital literacy gaps by industry. So we'll have some fact sheets that you can take up to the Hill to say, here are the gaps for manufacturing workers, here are the gaps for healthcare workers. So those are in your conference app already. You can take a peek at them now. But think about connecting those dots in your WIOA conversations.
I mean, I'll just add, I mean, I think to the point that you made, Katie, you know, I think I mean, again, it's hard to believe it's been almost 6 years since we reauthorized WIOA. Time really flies. But again, yeah, there's a lot of staff and there are a lot of members for whom WIOA is just kind of, it's always existed, right? It's always been there. And so, So I do think it's important to kind of reinforce as you're up on the Hill on Wednesday, just the importance of that continued investment. I mean, there's a lot of residual goodwill on the Hill still around WIOA reauthorization. I think there's still a perception that it was the first of a series of bipartisan education and training bills. If you think about, WIOA preceded ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, and then it preceded the Perkins Act reauthorization. So I think there's a real sense that WIOA was part of the beginning of a real bipartisan stretch for education and training. But I think it's important to, even though we're not likely to get to a full reauthorization discussion this year, I think it's really important for us to be conveying to policymakers, to lawmakers on the Hill and others, just the importance of WIOA as a foundation for so much of the work that you all do in your communities, and making sure that we don't lose that momentum, we don't lose that forward-going effort. There's no reason why we have to wait another 14 years for WIOA to be reauthorized. We could actually have a reauthorization sooner, and we could actually increase the investments that we're making in skills to take advantage of economic opportunities.
That's a great point, because the reauthorization may not happen this year, but funding certainly will. Melissa. Another reauthorization that is not likely to happen, but is live for advocacy is TANF. So where is the conversation and where has NSC been focused?
So normally when you start with the reauthorization not likely to happen, I might be a little bit depressed. But since we just talked about 14 years for reauthorization, that puts everything in perspective. So TANF has not been reauthorized since 2005. And I'm going to take a step back for those of you all who might be a little bit newer to talking about temporary assistance for needy families, or TANF. It's one of the nation's most important anti-poverty programs. And it was created as a part of welfare reform back in the 1990s. And it's funded at $16.5 billion each year. And that goes to the states in the form of block grants. And they use that to help thousands of families through cash assistance, through training, through supports while people are in training. The program does a lot, but it could do so much more, right? Especially when you think about all of the families that are in need. And here's one of the problems with TANF. This is why it's not doing as much as it could be. When welfare reform happened in the 1990s, one of the outcome measures or the performance measures that was created literally requires participants to record that they're spending X amount of hours, 30 hours a week in a lot of cases, on job search or some other qualifying activity. On top of that, we're making it harder for folks to access skills training through TANF because we're treating it differently. Participants only get credit for participating in training if they're doing that on top of other qualifying activities. So we're doing a lot of measuring activities. We're not measuring whether people are getting jobs. We're not measuring how much they're earning in those jobs. We're not measuring credentials that they get while in the program, if they are allowed to train within the program, because that's a whole other issue. So all of this clearly makes no sense, and that's why hence the problem. So our ask is that we modernize the TANF program so that we're measuring outcomes instead of measuring all of these activities and work requirements. In doing that, we hope that more people will get access to the training that they need within the TANF program. And we've seen some movement here. So here's the reason to be optimistic. We've seen movement here in May 2018 for the first time in a long time. There was a bill that moved through House committee and then saw movement on the Senate side as well. But those talks have died down a little bit, but that's where you all come in. You all can revive those conversations. And you all know that there are much smarter ways that we could be using $16.5 billion. And you have this new polling on your side too. We know that 85% of voters And 65% of business leaders support policies that make it easier for people who are receiving government assistance to get access to training. So you have the facts on your side. The time is right for kind of reviving those conversations. We've seen some momentum, so you all can take that. I hope that you all will take that message to the Hill with you on Wednesday.
That's great. Another big conversation happening on the Hill, Amanda, is immigration. Many folks in this room probably saw your most recent blog post where you detailed a lot of what's happening at the federal level related to skills. But what has been happening on immigration, and where's the skills component that NSC's been focused on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the great privileges of doing this work is I get to travel a fair bit, and as I travel, I tend to encounter folks and they ask what I do for a living, and when I say immigration, there's always a little bit of a pause. And folks say, how's that going right now? And what I tell them is always the truth. I say it is hard at the federal level. There's a lot of policies out there that aren't helping people. But at the state and local level, there is some extraordinary work going on. And I think that's really important for Congress to hear, right? Because while the feds have been stuck, the states and localities have been getting out in front of things and really creating some innovative policies that recognize the critical role that immigrants play in our workforce. So I'm going to give you a little bit of information now. Katie mentioned the blog post I did. If you want to delve deeper, we're not doing a separate breakout on immigration this year, but the blog post does have information. You're also welcome to come buttonhole me at any point in the next couple of days. The first act is around Dreamers. So the Supreme Court will be ruling on the DACA case between now and June. Just as a reminder, the Dreamers are the 2 million young people who came to this country without authorized immigration status. The Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program gave about 700,000 of those 2 million a temporary work permit and temporary protection from deportation. President Trump is seeking to end the program. A series of states have sued in order to prevent that from happening. The Supreme Court will be ruling sometime between now and June on that issue. But regardless of how the court rules, only Congress can create a permanent path to citizenship. And National Skills Coalition has really been at the forefront, and you have been at the forefront in the past few years in talking about why there needs to be a middle skills pathway to citizenship. A lot of the Dreamers that get high-profile attention are those who are earning 4-year degrees or who are in professional level jobs like lawyers or doctors. But we know that the bulk of Dreamers are actually earning middle skill credentials. They are working adults. They are raising families of their own. They are now in their late 20s into their 30s. And so it is critically important. The House passed the Dream and Promise Act this year in a bipartisan vote. The Senate needs to act. Now, I'm honor-bound to also mention to you that an important part of our coalition are our colleagues and friends at United We Dream. They're very concerned with making sure that any bargain that might happen in the Senate does not come at the expense of kind of ramping up the enforcement apparatus that's been targeting Dreamers and their families. So if you're curious about that, again, more information in the blog post. The middle skills pathway to citizenship is in the House bill. It's in the Senate bill. It is something we have advocated for. It has strong bipartisan support, and it is really important that you help Congress feel the urgency about that. The second piece on immigration is immigrant integration, right? So most immigration legislation on the Hill goes through the Judiciary Committee, where people don't have expertise in workforce development. That's not what they do. Immigrant integration is about what happens after people have a green card. What happens after they're here? How do we help them really integrate into American society? Immigrants are 1 in 6 American workers. You can't have an American workforce development strategy without having an immigrant integration strategy. It's not possible. And yet, most of the conversation on the Hill has not really touched on that. We had a huge triumph late last year, due in part to the advocacy of a number of folks in this room. House Democrats introduced a bill called the New Deal for New Americans Act, which would invest significantly in integrated education and training, English language, and other services over and above the investments that already exist in WIOA. And I think the reason that skills had such a prominent place in that immigrant integration legislation is because of people like you. It is the message that you have been taking to the Hill, and more importantly, it is the work you have been doing on the ground in your local communities. So that message needs to be emphasized, right? Congress can't just think about immigration as an argument over people's legal status. It really has to be a conversation about workforce development and how we ensure that immigrants have equitable access and have the same investments in their skills as the other 5 and 6 American-born workers. And then finally, briefly, I wanted to mention the public charge issue. Many of you submitted comments on this about a year ago. The Trump administration has proposed new regulations that would make it significantly harder for people to get a green card. That is, people already here in this country legally and applying for permanent status would have a much more difficult time due to something called the public charge test. And that regulation has been on hold in the courts due to litigation. It is now scheduled to take effect on February 24th in every state except Illinois, where there's still a judge with an injunction. And the most important thing for you to know as you go up on the Hill is that investing in people's English and education will help them in the public charge test, right? We see a chilling effect. We see immigrant families scared of signing up for ESL classes, scared of participating in job training, but that won't count against them. And so that message needs to get out there, not just to your program participants when you get back home, but to congressional staff on the Hill so that they can let their district office staff in local districts know. Participating in workforce and education programs helps you, it doesn't hurt you. And we have 2 fact sheets on that are available on the National Skills Coalition website on that blog post on immigration that's linked on our front page, so very easy to find. That's the bottom line on immigration issues, and I do want to flag, I know it's been a tough year, and I am really proud and amazed every time I talk to folks at the local and state level who are continuing to move the skills conversation forward, even while the hubbub of all the rest of immigration keeps going.
That's a good way to end on an inspirational point about that conversation, Amanda. So if folks want to take 1 second to vote in the app, we actually have a tie for what my next question is going to be to the panelists. So if you haven't voted, vote now. And then I'm going to turn the mics over to folks in the audience for about 10 minutes of question and answer for you to ask the folks on the stage any questions you have going into the higher education and work-based learning breakouts today, and then thinking about as you prep for what the rest of the couple of days look like. All right, so without any changes to the polling, anybody on the stage dying to talk about one of these, the top tier ties? All right, let's talk about veterans in the workforce. And I will take moderator privilege here because what I want to focus on is recent polling that National Skills Coalition did. We did national polling earlier this year that found that 69% of veterans don't think that the United States is doing enough for veterans as they return to the, oh, and look, I'm influencing the votes, to do enough as they're returning to civilian life, and 95% of veterans agree that it would significantly help veterans for the government to invest more in workforce education and skills training programs. So outside of those polling stats, let's talk about what the skills role is in veterans. And Katie, as a former Hill staffer, let's start with you and think about what the staffers will be thinking about when they're asking folks about that question. And then I'll turn to anyone else that wants to jump in.
Well, I want to point out that one of my most favorite things about the issue of skills, which is why I work here, one of the reasons I work here, is that it is so bipartisan and it is infused in almost every legislative priority that you could think of in Congress. And so when you're on the Hill on Wednesday and you're talking about skills, and the representative or the staffer goes, that's great about skills, one of my priorities is veterans. You could be like, well, let's talk about veterans and skills. And so basically I do want to point out though, in all seriousness, veterans, a lot of them are using their GI benefits to, have access to a pathway after they come back from service or active duty. And a lot of them may not know that their GI benefits can be used for skills training programs like apprenticeships. And so increasing awareness is something that I think Hill staffers will be thinking about. How do we engage more veterans in the skills training system? And then also going back to the point of support services. A lot of veterans have, similar needs that we talked about: childcare, transportation, just basic skills integration to get into a program. And so again, like, a lot of them might not know that their GI benefits could be put towards support services. Some of them want more of their GI benefits to be able to go towards support services, as demonstrated by our polling. And so that's another really important lens to the conversation.
Anybody else want to? Okay, perfect. That's great. Thanks everybody in the audience for helping us get there. And thank you, Katie. Okay, so questions from the audience. We've got about 10 minutes to share any feedback and thoughts, reaction that people have, or things that they need to feel more prepared to go to the Hill. I should also flag that there'll be numerous opportunities throughout the next couple of days to ask folks who are up here additional questions.
Over there.
I think we've got a question back there.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Kaleba, you spoke about there being money for post-employment training. Familiar with transportation and childcare as pre-employment issues, but could you elaborate more on what some of those post-employment trainings are and needs?
Sure, I think you're referring to the Builds Act, where we were talking about both pre-employment. I mean, I think one of the things that we've heard from the field is that, and we've heard this both from employers and from folks who are providing the direct job training services, is, you can do a lot to help somebody get into a job, but a lot of times the issues like transportation, childcare, the things that are those kind of issues, they don't go away just because you have a job, right? You still have children, and you still need to care for them, and you still need transportation to get to a job site. And so one of the things that we built into the Builds Act was an expectation that there would still be funding available to help people transition into employment and stay in employment. So even as you're working on the job site, even as you may have a full-time job, there's still support services that'll be available for individuals in order to continue to sort of transition fully. And I think that the goal there, and I will say this is something that I think resonates on both sides of the aisle. They recognize that if employers are working with individuals who do have transportation issues or childcare issues, they recognize that is something that employers don't always feel fully equipped to deal with on their own. And so they really do welcome having partners in the community, whether it's community colleges or community-based organizations, labor unions, or others. They really do appreciate having somebody else who can help their new employees be successful. So that's the idea behind these sort of post-employment. It's what we call our work-based learning support fund approach, and that's really the purpose of that.
What other questions do we have from folks? Oh, over here.
Hi, my name is Connie Ashbrook, and I'm with the National Task Force on Tradeswomen's Issues. And in looking at the Builds Act, I know there's a lot of allowable underrepresented folks that could be served. And so I wonder what mechanisms might be put in place to make sure that everybody's being served fairly, and particularly from our point of view, that diverse women and men of color get the opportunities to get the services. Thank you.
Do you want to handle it?
Sure. Thanks, Connie. So there's two main pieces of quality assurance mechanisms within Builds Act that go towards targeting and ensuring that the funding is going not just to workers in an infrastructure industry, but workers who've been underrepresented within that infrastructure industry. So the first is that throughout the application process, there's a required analysis of how that partnership, how the recipient of those federal funds would be brought into, would be bringing in folks who have been underrepresented, including women, people of color, and people with disabilities. The second piece is the report out mechanism, where it would require the grant recipients to disaggregate the outcomes of participants by age, race, ethnicity. And then at the heart of some of the way that we've seen, and I feel like I am answering this for Connie, but channeling much of what Connie has taught me over the time that I've known Connie, which is that under current transportation bills, states are, like Kermit said, allowed to use some of these funds to support workforce development. And Oregon is one of the few states that's legislated or required use of those funds. And Oregon has been able to use that funding to support some of the child care and other support services for workers in infrastructure industries, and has actually seen the numbers shift on women's participation in particular in construction and infrastructure industries. And so I think learning from the example of a state like Oregon shows us that when we're investing in and creating the opportunities for local partnerships to be investing in workers and the supports that workers need to succeed, that we can have a measurable impact on equity and access within those industries. So thank you, Connie. And folks should seek Connie out to ask about what the good results of some of that work has been, and the others that are here from the Tradesmen's Task Force. So other questions?
Hello, good afternoon. Adriana Crawford, Grant Associates. So in having these conversations around the difficulties or challenges with TANF, as well as a little bit more conversations around reauthorizing WIOA, there is significant an overlap, at least in my local area, between TANF recipients and those who engage with the American Job Center system. And so my question is, how can we best frame the conversation around the need to pass some of these acts, recognizing that those who are recipients, who are TANF recipients, can best be served when they engage with the American Job Center system, which is, of course, primarily funded with WIOA and other core partners as well.
Yeah, well, I'll start off. I know you'll have something to supplement there, but because I'm going to cite your paper.
Oh, okay.
So one of the things that NFC has written about in the past year has been about aligning the TANF outcome measures, the performance measures in TANF with WIOA, because there's already in legislation coordination points between TANF and WIOA. We have the combined planning. We have the fact that TANF is given priority of service for WIOA system. So, and as I said before, we are measuring absolutely the wrong things in TANF. So why not measure the right things, or more of the right things with WIOA, right? So that is part of kind of the infrastructure that we can create to talk about those things together. Is let's talk about earnings after exit. Let's talk about credential attainment. Let's talk about measurable skill gains within TANF too, because as Andy said at the beginning, we're trying to recreate the rules about who gets to succeed in America. And that means folks who are participating in TANF, folks who are participating in WIOA. As you said, there is a lot of overlap between those two populations. And a lot of times TANF funds can be used for the supportive services that we all know are so critical to completing a program that somebody might get access to through WIOA. So I hope that answers the question.
And we are just at time right now, so I want to recognize that now I'm finally seeing a couple hands, although my eyes with these lights have been a horrible moderator. But so we're just at time now to end this session, but there will be lots of opportunities for folks on this stage to answer questions. We also will share any resources and answer any questions through the app that seem like they may have universal application to folks in the room. So if there are opportunities to engage with us, to keep checking for updates on the app, then we'll be sure that the questions that folks have today are addressed and shared with the rest of the attendees. So with that, I will turn it back over to Andy Van Clunen, and thank you to our panelists for sharing their expertise and inspiring everyone for Wednesday.